In early 2025, the Pentagon confirmed what defense analysts had been warning about for years. China now operates the largest navy in the world, over 370 warships and climbing. The United States, the power that has controlled the world's oceans since 1945, has roughly 290. But strip away the modern details, and this is a story over a century old. The last time a rising power built a fleet to challenge the world's dominant naval force, it helped start a world war. Here's what most analysts get wrong about USA versus China military power in 2025. The danger isn't really the hardware, the hypersonic missiles, the stealth fighters, the aircraft carriers. It's the psychology that accumulates around them, the mutual suspicion, the worst-case planning on both sides, the slow erosion of trust until a crisis that could have been managed becomes one that can't. So the question at the center of all this, the one being debated in war rooms in Washington and Beijing right now, even if they phrase it differently, is straightforward but genuinely difficult. When a rising military power begins to rival the established one, what determines whether the competition stays cold or turns catastrophic? The historical record has answers, but they don't all point the same way. To understand why this question is urgent right now, why USA versus China military competition in 2025 isn't just another policy debate, consider what's changed in just the last decade. In 2015, China's People's Liberation Army was still largely a land-based force designed for regional defense. A decade later, the transformation is staggering. China has launched 3 aircraft carriers. The third, the Fujian, carries electromagnetic catapult systems, rivaling American technology. Chinese shipyards are producing warships at a rate the United States hasn't matched since the Second World War. The DF-21D and DF-26 ballistic missiles, sometimes called carrier killers, are specifically designed to threaten the U.S. Navy's ability to operate in the Western Pacific. And Chinese hypersonic glide vehicles, successfully tested multiple times, can evade existing missile defense systems. The United States has responded. The 2022 National Defense Strategy named China as the pacing challenge, Pentagon language for the adversary that drives everything. The AUKUS pact with Australia and the United Kingdom centers on nuclear-powered submarines for the Indo-Pacific. Military exercises with Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea have intensified. New American medium-range missile capabilities have been deployed to the region for the first time since the Cold War. And at the center of all of this sits Taiwan. Xi Jinping has stated publicly that reunification with Taiwan cannot be passed from generation to generation indefinitely. Chinese military exercises around the island have grown larger and more frequent. The 2022 exercises after Nancy Pelosi's visit essentially rehearsed a blockade. The United States, meanwhile, has moved from decades of deliberate ambiguity about whether it would defend Taiwan to increasingly explicit signals that it would. Both sides are preparing for a conflict that neither officially says it wants. But the military infrastructure being built on both sides creates its own momentum. Every new capability one side deploys becomes justification for the other side's next investment. Every military exercise is simultaneously a deterrent and a provocation, depending on which capital you're sitting in. This dynamic, a rising military power building capabilities that threaten the established power's dominance while the established power scrambles to maintain its edge, has played out before, and the outcomes varied dramatically. That's what makes the history so valuable. Not because it predicts the future, but because it reveals the variables that actually matter. In 1897, Kaiser Wilhelm II appointed Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz as Secretary of State of the German Imperial Naval Office. Tirpitz had a vision and a plan. Germany, he argued, was a rising industrial power trapped in a strategic box. Britain controlled the world's oceans, and that control gave it a chokehold on German trade, German colonies, and German ambitions. The solution was to build a fleet large enough that Britain would think twice before opposing Germany, what Tirpitz called a risk fleet. The logic seemed perfectly sound from Berlin. Germany wasn't trying to surpass the Royal Navy, it was trying to build enough naval power that confrontation would be too costly for Britain to risk, deterrence, not dominance, But that is not how London saw it. Britain's First Sea Lord, Admiral Jackie Fisher, looked at Tirpitz's shipbuilding programme and saw an existential threat. Britain was an island nation. Its empire, its trade, its food supply, all of it depended on naval supremacy. Any fleet large enough to challenge the Royal Navy was, by definition, a threat to British survival. It didn't matter what Berlin said about its intentions. Capabilities, not intentions, drove the calculation. And this is where the psychology took over. Fisher responded with the Dreadnought, a revolutionary battleship so powerful it rendered every existing warship obsolete overnight. The idea was to reset the naval balance decisively in Britain's favour. Instead, it reset the balance to zero. Germany's older ships were now just as obsolete as Britain's older ships. The race started over, and this time both sides were building from scratch. Between 1906 and 1914, Britain and Germany poured staggering resources into warship construction. Each new German battleship confirmed British fears. Each British response confirmed Germany's fears that Britain would never accept Germany as an equal. Diplomatic channels existed, but they couldn't overcome the logic of the arms race itself, because when both sides are building weapons aimed at each other, every conversation about peace happens in the shadow of preparation for war. Tirpitz and Fisher never met face to face. They were adversaries who understood each other's navies in extraordinary technical detail, but understood each other's fears hardly at all. Tirpitz genuinely believed Britain would eventually accept Germany's right to a powerful fleet. Fisher genuinely believed Germany was building that fleet for one purpose, to destroy British power. Both were rational actors. Both were wrong about the other's intentions, and the arms race ensured that neither had any way to prove the other wrong. What matters for the current moment is this: Germany and Britain didn't go to war because of their naval rivalry alone. The crisis came in the Balkans in 1914, triggered by an assassination that had nothing to do with navies. But the arms race had created the conditions, the mutual suspicion, the rigid alliance structures, the military timetables that couldn't be paused once activated, that turned a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. The naval competition didn't cause the war, it made the war possible by ensuring that when a spark flew, everything was already soaked in gasoline. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, watching Europe slide toward war in August 1914, reportedly said, "The lamps were going out all over Europe." What he didn't say, what nobody fully grasped at the time, was that the lamps had been dimming for years, one naval appropriations bill at a time. Remember the question: what determines whether military competition stays cold or turns catastrophic? In the British-German case, the answer is grim. The arms race created a security dilemma so deep that both sides' rational preparations for defense made the other side's rational fear of attack worse. And when the crisis finally came, there was no trust left to manage it. But that's not the only template. There's another military rivalry, one that was far more dangerous on paper, with weapons that could have ended civilization, that produced a fundamentally different outcome. By the early 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union had accumulated enough nuclear warheads to destroy each other several times over. The military competition between them made the Anglo-German naval race look modest. And yet, across 4 decades, not a single direct shot was fired between them. The standard answer is nuclear deterrence. Mutual assured destruction made war too costly. And that's part of it. But deterrence alone doesn't explain what happened in October 1962, when the competition nearly became a catastrophe anyway. When American reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, President Kennedy faced a choice eerily similar to the ones that confronted European leaders in 1914. His military advisors nearly unanimously recommended airstrikes followed by invasion. The logic was textbook: eliminate the threat before it becomes operational. From a purely military standpoint, they were right, but Kennedy hesitated. He had recently read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, her account of how the great powers stumbled into World War I through escalation, miscalculation, and the momentum of military timetables that no leader could stop once they started moving. The book haunted him. He understood, in a way that leaders in 1914 didn't, how a rational sequence of military decisions could produce an irrational outcome. So instead of airstrikes, he chose a naval blockade, an option his generals considered weak, and critically, he opened a back channel to Khrushchev through Soviet ambassador Dobrynin. Both leaders, privately terrified of where the crisis was heading, found a way to step back. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles. Kennedy quietly removed American Jupiter missiles from Turkey months later. The world came within hours of nuclear war and was saved in part because one leader happened to have read the right book at the right time. What made the Cold War rivalry manageable when the Anglo-German one wasn't? Two things. First, the nuclear dimension made the consequences of failure impossible to abstract away. You could imagine surviving a naval battle. You could not imagine surviving a thermonuclear exchange. That clarity concentrated minds. Second, and this is the variable that matters most for USA versus China military power today, both sides eventually built the communication infrastructure to match the military infrastructure. The hotline between Washington and Moscow was established immediately after Cuba, precisely because both sides realized how close they'd come. In the decades that followed, SALT, START, the ABM Treaty, these weren't signs of friendship, they were mechanisms for managing a rivalry that both sides acknowledged could destroy them. The competition was real, the hostility was real, but the architecture for preventing catastrophe existed alongside the architecture for waging war. In 1914, it didn't, and there's an even more surprising case worth examining briefly. In the late 19th century, the world's dominant naval power faced a rising challenger whose industrial capital and fleet were growing rapidly. The established power was Britain. The rising challenger was the United States. By 1900, American industrial output had surpassed Britain's, and the US Navy was expanding fast. Britain could have treated this the way it treated the German buildup, as a mortal threat. Instead, Britain made a strategic calculation. The United States could be a partner rather than a rival. Over 2 decades, Britain systematically retreated from strategic competition in the Western Hemisphere, settled outstanding disputes, and gradually accepted American dominance in the Atlantic. The transition was so smooth that most people today don't remember it as a power transition at all. What made it possible? Geography helped enormously. 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean made America far less threatening than Germany, 300 miles across the North Sea. But so did a judgment made in London that accommodation served British interests better than confrontation. Then consider the opposite case. Japan in the 1930s, a rising military power convinced the existing order was designed to contain it. Like Germany before it, Japan's military buildup was driven by a perception, not entirely wrong, that Western powers were blocking its legitimate ambitions. But Japan's leaders made a catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed a devastating first strike at Pearl Harbor would convince the United States to negotiate rather than fight a long war across the Pacific. The assumption that a short, sharp military action could produce a political settlement was not just wrong, it was the precise opposite of what actually happened. So what does USA versus China military power in 2025 actually look like through these lenses? The uncomfortable answer is that it contains elements of all these patterns simultaneously. Like the Anglo-German rivalry, the military buildup in the Western Pacific has its own momentum. Each side's defensive preparations look offensive from the other side. China's carrier-killer missiles are defensive from Beijing's perspective, designed to keep American naval forces away from China's coast. From Washington's perspective, they're offensive, designed to prevent the United States from defending Taiwan and its Pacific allies. Same weapons, opposite interpretations. That's the security dilemma in its purest form, and it's the dynamic that turned manageable tensions into catastrophe in 1914. But, like the Cold War, there's a nuclear dimension. China's nuclear arsenal is expanding rapidly, from an estimated 500 warheads in 2023 to a projected 1,000 by 2030, according to Pentagon estimates. The logic of mutual destruction applies. Neither side can win a nuclear exchange. The critical variable, the one the historical record identifies as decisive, is whether the communication and crisis management infrastructure can keep pace with the military infrastructure. In 1914, it couldn't. The military timetables outran the diplomatic channels. In 1962, it barely did, and only because Kennedy, through an accident of recent reading, understood the danger of letting military logic drive political decisions. The question for 2025 is whether Washington and Beijing are building the diplomatic channels, the military-to-military contacts, and the crisis management protocols that could prevent a Taiwan Strait incident or a South China Sea collision from escalating beyond anyone's intention. The signs on that front are mixed. Military-to-military communications between the US and China were suspended after Pelosi's Taiwan visit in 2022, restored partially in late 2023, and remain fragile. There is no equivalent of the Cold War hotline that both sides treat as inviolable. There are no arms control frameworks. The institutional architecture for managing this rivalry is thin, far thinner than what existed between Washington and Moscow by the 1970s. Here's what the history clarifies and what it doesn't. It clarifies that military buildups don't cause wars by themselves, but they create the conditions in which wars become possible. The trigger is always something else, an assassination, a miscalculation, a crisis that arrives before the communication channels are ready for it. And it clarifies that the most dangerous period isn't when one side is clearly dominant. It's during the transition, when the rising power is strong enough to challenge, but not yet strong enough to feel secure, and the established power is still strong enough to fight, but aware that the window may be closing. What history doesn't tell you is which pattern the United States and China will follow. That depends on choices that haven't been made yet by leaders in both capitals about whether to invest as seriously in crisis management as they're investing in missile systems. The arms race is already underway. The question is whether the other race, the one to build the institutional architecture that prevents competition from becoming catastrophe, is keeping pace. In every historical case, that's the race that actually mattered.
Like if this was interesting, hit the subscribe for more and turn that notification bell on.